Welcome to the Experiencer Group Roundtable. I'm Jake King, along with my Experiencer Group co-founders, Stuart Davis and Kirsten Blackburn.
Hello, everyone.
This is our 69th event since beginning in February, but it's only our second public one.
That's amazing.
Is that wild to you guys?
It's quite incredible. It feels like we just started doing this like yesterday.
Right? And it's like, okay, so if it's our 69th and it's our second public one, does that mean that we're just like super private people, or does it mean that we're coming out of our shell? Or both? What do you say?
Both, maybe.
Half full or half empty.
Right?
Now, are you including support meetings in that, Jay, or is this?
I am,
Yeah. For you, Ralph, if you, since maybe you don't know how we work here, we have these regular experiencer meetings about once a week, and that they're totally anonymous. And so folks can come on. We usually cap it at about 12 people, and we read an opening statement that basically says, keep this to yourself, and we'll not talk about what goes on here outside of the room. And then experiencers are able to talk to each other. And it's so far been going beautifully, just beautifully, in my opinion.
We're very honored to have a great guest with us today, Ralph Blumenthal. For more than 45 years, Blumenthal reported for the New York Times as Texas correspondent and Southwest bureau chief, arts and culture news reporter, investigative and crime reporter, foreign correspondent in West Germany, South Vietnam, and Cambodia, and Metro and Westchester correspondent. He notably co-authored the recent series of groundbreaking New York Times articles on the secret Pentagon program to investigate UFOs with Leslie Kean and Helene Cooper. He led the Times Metro team that won the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news coverage of the 1993 truck bombing of the World Trade Center. Ralph earned a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism Alumni Award, and the Nyman Foundation's Worth Bingham Prize for Distinguished Investigative Reporting. Since 2010, he has taught journalism in the summer program of Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, and was named Distinguished Lecturer at Baruch College, where he taught journalism and currently oversees historic collections in the Newman Library Archives. He lives in New York City with his wife, Deborah, who's a children's book writer and novelist. Ralph has written and co-authored 7 books on organized crime and cultural history. His most recent book is The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack, published by High Road Books of the University of New Mexico Press. Ralph, it's great to have you here.
Jay, thank you so much for inviting me. Privileged to meet all of you.
Now, I heard you started working on this book about maybe a decade or so ago. And of course, your bombshell front page story with Leslie and Helene, the A-tip story with those 3 now world famous cockpit UFO videos, that initial New York Times story was just less than 4 years ago. So some people might be looking at this new book on John Mack and his research with experiencers of non-human entities, alien abductees, and think you went from those cockpit videos and the Tic Tac and worked your way up or out to this, when in some ways, maybe it was the other way around. Did your research into John Mack's work and having access to his records of experiencer cases, did that actually help light the fire? Did it help in your determination to get these big UFO stories published in the Times?
Yeah, in a word, it certainly prepared the way. I mean, I wish it were only a decade, Jay. It was 16 years that I was working on the John Mack book, and it did play a part in this way. I started on the John Mack book in 2004 when I was a correspondent in Texas, and I came across Passport to the Cosmos, his second book, and it absolutely blew me away. I didn't know how famous he already was. I didn't know that he'd been on Oprah. He met with the Dalai Lama. I didn't know he won a Pulitzer Prize for writing about Lawrence of Arabia. I was going to call him up for an interview. I thought he'd make a great interview with the New York Times, a Harvard psychiatrist who's interested in alien encounters. And then, of course, I pick up the paper a few days later and find he'd been run over in London and killed. So I kept in touch with the family, and that's really what started me off. So my book really goes back to 2004. But in the course of researching the book, I ran into or contacted Leslie, who was, of course, Bud Hopkins' close companion for many years. And because Bud Hopkins was the one who got John interested in alien abduction, I did get to meet Bud, actually, and I interviewed him shortly before he died of cancer. But through Bud, I met Leslie, and she gave me access to some things that Bud had. So Leslie and I had stayed in touch over the years. And Leslie, of course, wrote that great book on UFOs called UFO, Pilots, Generals, and, Go on the Record. That book came out in 2010. So there's a long roundabout answer to your question, Jay, but Leslie told me in 2017 that she had just been to this meeting in Washington with Lou Elizondo and others that revealed the existence of this secret Pentagon unit investigating UFOs. So that's the story we brought to the Times, and I can go into detail on that. But anyway, I don't think I would have been as interested in the UFO story about ATIP if I hadn't already been deep into my research of John Mack. And I had written a story in Vanity Fair in 2013 that recapped my investigation of John Mack up till then. I had just sort of basically started looking into his papers and doing interviews. But to answer your question more directly now, I was primed to be interested in the UFO story because of my work on the John Mack book, but they were worlds apart because there's nothing in the Pentagon stuff about alien technology. They're not saying where, these things, these objects come from, et cetera. So I have to be careful in my reporting for the Times not to go into any of the alien encounters, because that is much less proven to the satisfaction of the Times, for sure, and to me, than the UFO sightings.
You do such a deft job of, and of course you do with your long history in terms of discernment, in terms of what's going to kind of make the grade there, and that's, I'm sure that has a huge amount to do with why people trust you with things like, say, going through John Mack's archives and having access to these private conversations and these case histories and things like this. There are so many fly on the wall moments in reading The Believer where, as the reader, you can't help but wish you were there, because it seems like he ran into half of everybody at some point. Lawrence Rockefeller, Stan Groff, Oprah, Yasser Arafat, Lily Tomlin, goes on and on. One really amazing meeting of the minds that you document a bit in the book is when Dr. Mack's invited to a secret conference on extraterrestrials that was held by the Dalai Lama and his inner circle. John Mack and the Dalai Lama speak, and you quote in the book that the Dalai Lama turned to Mack and said, "What do you think?" And "I think we have a lot to learn from each other," Mack replied, referring to aliens and humans. "I think they connect with us to get knowledge of the heart and spirit and of us. But we learn from them that there is a spirit world. There's a universe beyond this narrow one." So one interesting thing there is that it seems like there is definitely some overlap at this conference, as one might expect, in looking at aliens and also what Buddhists and others maybe talk about as the subtle realms, that some of these non-human entities might be coming in or interacting from some other layer of reality. So you were able to go through the private documentation of this secret conference with the Dalai Lama. Did you find anything else from that conference that really blew your mind but couldn't make it into the book, or maybe seemed too sensitive?
It was very interesting. First of all, John kept his own record. He brought along one of his own people to record, to take notes on the conference. It was a secret conference, as you said. The Dalai Lama, who has a very difficult relationship with China, of course, having fled Tibet. So the Dalai Lama was not eager to, are we okay with the connection? I'm seeing something here that.
I think you froze for a second.
Did I go out?
Yeah, you went out for just a second.
Well, let me just say that John Mack had many experiences with alien interference on a lot of his programs. And I have encountered the same thing, that I don't know whether it's in internet instability or what, but there is a whole history of gremlins interfering in these kind of programs. So let's start with that and take it as a matter of course that this does happen. It happens. You can get a technological explanation, or you can say John Mack encountered it too. So I just go with it. But to get back to the question, it was supposed to be a secret conference, and John Mack brought his people along to transcribe it. And it went for almost a week, and there were almost daily sessions, a lot of material. And I got access to those transcripts in John Mack's files. They don't exist anywhere else, as far as I know. And I was kind of cautioned to be careful with these because I didn't get the Dalai Lama's permission to use them, because I didn't think I needed to. John Mack was there, and this was basically a transcript of their discussions. So I found that very interesting. The Dalai Lama was really very open to these discussions of alien encounters because, as you noted, he comes from the Buddhist world, where the subtle realms, they understand that reality is more than the four corners of our, 3 dimensions and time of our existence. There's something else going on. And so he was very interested in this. He didn't know much about the alien encounters that John Mack had come across, but he knew about strange stories in Buddhist culture of penetration from the hidden realms into our so-called reality. So that's what made it so interesting, that Dalai Lama was really open to this. Now, there were some people who brought up all kinds of things at this conference. There was a woman who was very interested in cloud formations and was trying to tell the Dalai Lama that there were hidden messages in the clouds. And I don't think he bought that. He said sometimes cloud is just cloud. But there were a lot of different efforts to grapple with this phenomenon, which to this day, nobody understands. I mean, your members have had all these experiences, which captivated John and me when I hear about them, but nobody knows where they come from, or why they come to you and not somebody else. And it remains a colossal mystery.
Along those lines, were there some other incredible pieces of information you found in John's archives in general that couldn't make it into the book? Anything in particular that comes to mind?
Well, there were things that didn't make it into the book. You added that at the end. I was going to talk about some things that did make it into the book, because I start off the book really with the story of the 1992 conference at MIT, which is another thing that's not well known. In 1992, some of the world's leading atomic scientists and psychologists, psychiatrists, folklorists, religion scholars gathered at MIT, of all places, to grapple with this phenomenon, to try to understand what was behind it. But that story is in the book. And again, MIT, Dave Pritchard, the atomic scientist who organized it at MIT with John Mack, put out a 630-page book 2 years later of these transcripts, which I say that every so-called skeptic and debunker needs to read before they write this off as mental illness or, sleep paralysis and all these pat explanations, which don't really go to the heart of it, because a lot of these things, as you know better than anybody else, don't happen at night during sleep. They happen when you're driving your car or walking by yourself or, fully awake. So anyway, so I tell that story in the book about the MIT conference. There were stories I got in the course of researching the thing that I didn't put into the book because they were very private. They were sensitive. As you know, a lot of people have these experiences and they're not eager to talk about them. They will talk anonymously. What I was actually surprised about is how many people did agree to be public. I mean, Randy Nickerson, for example, Peter Faust. A lot of people have come forward very bravely and endured a lot of ridicule in the process to come out on the record. But there are others. I mean, I met with one experiencer who's in John Mack's book, the first book, who was desperately afraid of being identified. And he made me swear and, all kinds of things not to disclose his identity. And so, yeah, there are things I found out that I didn't put in the book, personal things about John that I didn't think were appropriate.
Yeah, I appreciate that discretion, especially with regard to experiencers' identities and anonymity and coming forward, all of those considerations. That's incredibly appreciated. Speaking of people that have come out as experiencers, it'd be wonderful to hear from Stuart Davis.
Thank you for being with us, Ralph. This is a great joy. Great appreciator of your work over all these years. In diving into The Believer and in having you here today, one of the things that's been forward in my mind and curiosity is what the strangest experience of your life has been. Take a few minutes. I don't know if it's something you've reflected on much or anticipated, but I'm sure curious about it. I wonder what it was and what its impact has been over time. How difficult was it to metabolize or integrate whatever it may have been, and how has it changed you?
Well, as you know, Stuart, we Times reporters are not used to talking about ourselves. All our training is to keep ourselves out of the picture. But I will share something that happened to me very recently. First of all, I have never seen a UFO. I have never gone through an abduction. I've never encountered alien beings like John. He thought for a while it was disappointing that he hadn't. And I have a little thing in the book where he talks to one of his experiencers in Newport at that gathering every year at Anne's house in Newport. Anyway, and he said to this experiencer, how come I never see one? I can't. And she said, well, maybe you're not patient enough, John. They got a big kick out of that he was so impatient. Anyway, the truth is, so I have not had that kind of an experience. But less than a year ago, I was writing up a Robert Bigelow, the space scientist and anomaly researcher, billionaire, who has a new contest going now on afterlife experiences and the best evidence of an afterlife, which I wrote up in the New York Times. And I was writing that story. He put up $1 million actually as a reward for the best evidence of survival of consciousness, okay? So I was writing up that story in the New York Times, and at about 5:30 in the morning, I was lying in bed thinking about the story and what I was going to say. And suddenly there was a tremendous explosion. I jumped out of bed. My wife was wakened. The dog jumped up. And it turned out the window of my terrace door, 12 stories up over the street, had exploded. And whether it was a temperature inversion or it wasn't a bird, because there was no bird that hit the window that I could see. It wasn't a pebble, because a pebble wouldn't be 12 stories up. So something happened. The window exploded. It shook me up a lot. And I thought later that, when I was writing the book too, I used to get like downloads of information during the night. Either my mind was working overtime, or I was getting information from somewhere saying, put this in, don't forget this. So to answer your question, I've had some strange experiences in writing this book, quite apart from the synchronicities that I talk about, how my path, it turned out, crossed with John Mack's and his family members in some strange ways that Carl Jung would appreciate, but I couldn't explain. Like one time I was trying to track down John Mack's cousin, who had some important biographical information. He was elderly, and I couldn't find him. And when I finally found him, he was living across the street from me. So I just had to cross the street to find her. So Terry Liebman, whose family founded the Rheingold Brewing Brewery. Anyway, so to answer your question, yeah, I've had strange, and I happen to believe in spiritual dimensions that we don't understand. I do believe that there are things we don't understand and can't explain given our current knowledge of physics or science. But I haven't had the conventional experiences that many of your members have had, the so-called core narrative and that kind of thing. Why, I don't know, neither did John Mack.
And a super quick follow-up, how do you interpret the exploded window at this point, reflecting back on it?
Well, first of all, the guy who came to fix the window said maybe there was a temperature difference between the glass, the two panes of glass. But why it would happen while I was in bed thinking about survival of consciousness and life after death, that moment the temperature chose to exert its pressure is interesting. I think we do get messages from other realms. I do believe that. I've had, as I said in writing the book, I would get messages to make sure about this, or keep your eye on this. And I of course I can't prove that it comes from anywhere supernatural, let's say, but I do believe there are things we don't understand, that our knowledge of quote reality is faulty. So we don't know a lot of things. Physics is making great leaps into the unknown. They're finding out a lot of strange things about the universe, but 95% of the universe is still unexplained and unknown between dark matter and dark energy. They just don't know what makes up the energy and the mass of the universe. They found one particle, the Higgs boson, a few years ago, one particle after trillions and trillions of experiments underground. So there's hints about, different strange aspects to the universe. So they don't know. So I like to obviously you keep an open mind.
That's really interesting. Thank you for being forthcoming. I know it's not your first nature as a New York Times writer to share your own first-person subjective experiences, but I think they are a point of great interest for a lot of us here in the community. So really appreciative of that. And I'll just do one quick follow-up, which is around the RAL school. We talk about what it takes to punch through the membrane of our existing constructs and interpretations and the somewhat phlegmatic nature of our culture and its slow moving nature when it comes to change. It seems like if there would have been an event that could have changed the world in terms of, wow, we're not alone. You talked about how many of the pat responses and interpretations just don't stand up, whether it's sleep paralysis, some sort of new psychopathological delusion. And this is a great instance of not only do they not hold up, but how do you account for dozens and dozens of kids on this playground? And as you go into the book, there's actually many events on the front and the back of this as well. It was a much broader radius, that being perhaps the epicenter that has continued to resonate forward in the coming decades. But in reading about that and John's central position in that event, I wondered how it feels for you doing such groundbreaking work in the Times in the most recent years. I would say arguably as much or more than anything, your work in the Times has moved the ball with this enigma. How much is one question I would like to ask you. How much do you feel the ball has moved? And when you look back at REL and you feel what you feel around all of these witnesses in broad daylight, having face-to-face encounters with these entities, do you feel dispirited like, wow, if that didn't change things, what will it take? Or does that increase your resolve? Or do you have the kind of personhood that's like, you know what, damn it, I'm really sinking my heels in now, and I'm just in here for the long haul? Which way does that land for you?
A lot of good questions there, Jay, altogether. First of all, let me talk about the Ariel School, because that is an important part of the book. It's a very important case. It's really that, along with the Betty and Barney Hill abduction experience, are really landmark cases. Ariel's particularly important because it concerned children, and John Mack was particularly influenced by the cases that concerned children, because children as young as 2 were not fabricating stories based on movies they had seen or books they'd read, or publicity that they wanted to get. There's a part in the book I talk about a 2-year-old child who was lying in his crib, making his little dog fly in the sky, and said, "Doggy, fly in the sky." And his mother, who was an experiencer, asked him, what are you saying? And he said, "Little man, take me into the sky. I fly in the sky." So John was very influenced by that, and he thought this 2-year-old is not influenced by the cultural milieu. So similarly, Ariel, where he went with Dominique, his girlfriend at the time, and he got these interviews on tape, which I have. These children were 8, 9, 10, and they were very articulate, and they just told John what they'd seen. 60 out of the 300 kids had seen this craft land and described 2 beings that interacted with them through their eyes, sort of hypnotically, through nonverbal communication, let's say, through their eyes. And these kids were getting messages about the planet and all that. And the kids later drew pictures for John and for the school. And the pictures were all very similar. And the stories were all similar, although not completely identical, by the way, which is another thing that John found very compelling, that the stories were not, it was not like somebody was reading off a script and let's all agree to tell this story. The stories had an infinite variety of very strange detail that you couldn't imagine making up. But anyway, there was a consistency to the stories that he found very persuasive. And that's what these kids were telling. They all, I mean, the 60 who happened to be at recess that day, and experienced this. And by the way, they're now grown up, these kids, because it happened in 1995, I believe, or 4. So what is it, 25 years later. And now there are documentaries. Randy Nickerson has done one. There've been others interviewing these former kids, now grown-ups, looking back on their experience, and they think it's one of the most formative things in their lives. They never forgot it, for sure. Anyway, so that is really one of the most important cases and the best testimony to the actual reality of this phenomenon, which everyone outside it has a very hard time believing because there's no proof that anybody can deliver, unlike with the UFOs. And your question deals also with my reporting today, and that at least has produced some physical evidence that we can grab onto. There are the Navy videos. And the Navy and the aircraft and the radar on the ships did get images and thermal imaging of these objects, quite apart from the observations of the pilots, who are the most highly trained observers we have in this country. Millions of dollars of training and equipment that you can't say these guys are crazy because they are operating these incredibly sophisticated aircraft, and they've seen these things too. But anyway, quite apart from the human observation, they have been recorded. So that's a big step forward. And the report that came out in June 25th, the UAP report, for the first time that I'm aware of, the government says these things exist. These things exist physically. We don't know what they are, where they're coming from, who's behind the wheel, what they want with us, but there's something there. It's not fly specks on the windshield. It's not the planet Venus. It's not marsh gas. All the things that have been trotted out by the government disingenuously or, for whatever reason over the years. So now these things exist, but we're not there with with aliens yet, whether we ever will be. So, what we have is the anecdotal accounts of experiences like yourselves, which are very difficult for non-experiencers to process. I sense in your question, you're trying to compare my reporting on the UFOs for the Times with the other research I did into experiencers. And it's a different order of magnitude, really, in terms of reporting. The UFO accounts are based, as I said, in large part on actual physical detection, measurement, and so that sets them apart. Am I depressed that we don't have full disclosure? No, it's a long process. I don't think it's going to be quick, but you got to think of where we came from. Just a few years ago, the government was, denying that these things existed or that there was any importance to them, telling fake stories that these things were weather balloons or, mental illness or the planet Venus. So now for the government to say in a report, these things physically exist, that's a huge step forward. So I'm not discouraged.
I too want to thank you so much for being here, Ralph. This is really a pleasure, and it's just lovely to have you here. So I want to ask you a question about you wrote a really wonderful in-depth article for Vanity Fair in May 2013, and it was called Alien Nation: Have Humans Been Abducted by Extraterrestrials? And I just, it's interesting because when I found that article, a while ago, it was a couple of years ago, I found it, and I have met several abductees / contactees who saw the article at the time as like this real watershed moment for experiencers. And they actually believed that that article should have sort of wrenched open the doors for disclosure as they, saw it at that time. But afterwards, these particular experiencers felt really disappointed that the mainstream media didn't really take that article and run with it at all. And so I'm wondering if you feel that that article was just too much ahead of its time. Was the giggle factor just too rampant, or do you think action was actually taken within the mainstream to sort of quash that story? I remember there was some fallout on Vanity Fair about that, but I don't remember exactly what the fallout was.
No, the fallout that you may be remembering, Kirsten, thank you for that, is I didn't fully understand an anecdote I put in at the end, and I corrected it in the book. But let me take that question apart a little bit. Again, I'm not disappointed that the Vanity Fair piece didn't change minds dramatically. The more I learn about this phenomenon, the more I know how difficult it is. And as many of your members know, I tried recently to do a story about experiencers for the New York Times, and for a lot of reasons, including the fact that the people who were behind this story, my editors, left for other reasons in the course of this. Between the long time it took to do the article and run it, people moved on, and I lost my champions. And then some more skeptical voices emerged, and they, why are we running this? And P.S. the piece has never run to this day. But I know how difficult it is, and you know better than I know how difficult it is to get credence for your stories. So when I wrote this story in Vanity Fair, it was really the information I had so far. I was working hard on the John Mack book, but it was really in the middle of my research, and I hadn't gone through all the documentation yet, and I had a lot to learn, and I hadn't met all the experiences myself yet. It was a work in progress, as I like to describe it. I mean, I was very proud of the piece. I thought Vanity Fair did a really nice job in putting it out online with great pictures. but I didn't expect it to change the culture overnight. It's just it's too difficult. It's a leap. The problem is that the people who've had these experiences know that they're absolutely real to them, that they're, it's not a dream, it's not a nightmare, it's absolutely something that happened in some level of reality that they can't explain. And people who have not had this experience cannot understand it because they haven't had it. So they say, oh, they're making it up, or they, dreaming, or they're looking for publicity, all the reasons that John Mack discarded that we know are not relevant. But to outsiders, that's the way they explain it. So the thing that you may remember about the Vanity Fair piece, at the end, I told a story about one of John's close associates, who he appeared. I tell this at the end of the book. There were people who say after John was run over and killed in 2004 in London, that he appeared to them, or his spirit appeared to them with various messages. And since he was investigating life after death, it's kind of poignant that they would seem to feel his presence after he was killed, that he returned with a message. So here was the story. According to one of his people, John appeared to her, and he said, it's not what we think. And she was totally taken aback because she thought that, after all the work they had done on abduction, here was John Mack coming from, beyond the grave to say, it's not what we think. Like, what else could it be? And then her husband died, and he appeared to her, she told me, and his message to her was, it's not what we think. And she didn't know what to make of that. What's not what we think? So her husband apparently was talking about death. It's not what we think. But John, she thought, was saying that the alien experience is not what. But anyway, she didn't know. And that was the thing in Vanity Fair I didn't quite get, but I cleared up in the book. But it only compounded the mystery. I mean, every time you think you're getting close to an answer, the answer recedes, as you know better than me. So anyway, but I found it fascinating because it just, got me thinking about, the enormity of the mystery we're confronting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's exactly what you say. It retreats, it messes with you just a little bit more when you think you've got something figured out. It is quite ironic and comical in that way. But the one thing about that article that's just occurring to me right now as you're answering is that during that time that I found that article, I think was the first period of time when Jay and I were putting together experiencer groups on Richard Dolan's site, and these were via Zoom. This may have been several months before that I found that article, and I just have to say it came by at exactly the right time, because there's information in that about how the experiencers met and that kind of thing that actually helped formulate what we do here now. So it's a great article, and it's a great article to keep referring back to. It's kind of a wonderful time capsule. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
That was a wonderful response, Ralph. And I appreciate you being candid about the nature of that experiencer article that you were working on. It's great.
I haven't given up on it. I mean, I'm hoping that I made other, by the way, you should know that after it got rejected by the Times, I have talked to other publications, and I've not had much success. It's a very difficult sell. It's a hostile environment out there to a large extent. I don't have to tell you, the skepticism in the society at large over your stories, and the difficulty of persuading people what is absolutely, real to you, persuading other people. And the mainstream media, there's a lot of resistance. And I only want to put this in a place where it would make some difference, not just put it out online, which I could do. So, but I have not given up, and I'm hoping to still find a home for it, but it is not easy.
Totally understood. And And I appreciate your efforts, and I know that our general community absolutely appreciates your efforts that way. You're a hero for even trying to do that. And
Absolutely.
along those lines, you and Leslie, also with your notable collaborator Helene Cooper, you've done such groundbreaking work getting the anomalous ball, maybe it's shaped like a tic tac, further down the mainstream field than just about anybody. Whether it's getting the news out about the secret ATIP program at the Pentagon, those 3 cockpit UFO videos, or even more recently, floating a serious reference to the possibilities of retrieved materials from these UFOs. You've succeeded in getting a bit further with such regularity that some people have almost come to expect it. In fact, with this book, it seems you're taking a really significant topic, John Mack's work with experiencers, alien abductees, and presenting it as this node. You have the node of your UFO stories for the times with Leslie, and kind of like her UFO book or Surviving Death, you're putting this other node out there and patiently waiting for people out there to connect these dots. Does that seem like a fair read to you?
Yeah, I haven't heard it described that way before, but that is interesting. I try to keep the nodes separate because I know, I found basically my experience with that experiencer article, it was not easy to get that in the New York Times. And as I say, I want to keep them separate because it's really one step at a time. The UFO reporting is based really on one set of circumstances. The experiencer stories are a different order of magnitude and much harder to get into the Times. And I don't want people to confuse the two. Your image of the nodes is a good one because the nodes are separate. They may be connected on some level, we don't know. But for example, I make a whole point when I talk about the UAP report and talking about our UFO reporting, that there is no reference to alien spacecraft and that they don't know what the government, the Pentagon, is not characterizing these objects, these things that are physically real. It's not characterizing them in any way to say that they have, they've come from a different part of the cosmos. They've traveled far. They're under intelligent control. They don't know any of that. So I try to keep that, very separate. And I think the Times understands that. They've been, good. They don't, try to lump me with one story or another story, and I don't try to promote the book with my UFO stories, because it's different. You have to, as I say, one step at a time.
I appreciate that, and I can see you kind of coming at it from both ends that way. Just this week, Congress is calling for a permanent office to address UAP phenomena as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. And some people online are questioning, is this just going to be Project Blue Book Chapter 2 or something like that? And of course, this office, this situation is partly happening because of public pressure that came about because of you and Leslie and Helene's initial article in the series that you and Leslie did after that, and the work of Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo and such. Do you have any comment or any thoughts on that office? Do you have any reason to feel optimistic or to wait and see about that?
Well, you're absolutely right. The last week has brought an interesting development. They are apparently creating this new office that will leapfrog the UAP task force and create maybe a larger, more powerful, prestigious office to investigate. So I know that Lou Elizondo thinks it's a big deal, and so that is progress. I think that's very important. I got to tell you that the internet, it can be a great hindrance and an advantage. It provides leads. It sets out information that is worthy of following up for serious reporters. But there's such a level of background noise, of chatter on the internet, that can get in your way. When Leslie and I were working on the retrieved materials story, we were hampered by the amount of speculation that, oh, the Times is going to break a huge story about this, and this is what the Times is working. The Times is working on materials, and it really got in the way. There were people who were mischaracterizing our research, who got a little piece of it. They found out we had talked to somebody. They would put that out on the internet, and it really got in the way. And I got kind of annoyed about it because we weren't really allowed to pursue the story methodically and quietly the way reporters like to pursue investigative stories. You don't want a crowd watching you and commenting on your next steps, and this is where they're heading, and this is what they're going to break. So it made it much more difficult. And I said that on programs. I said that it was a disservice to our reporting and made it all the more difficult. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know when I tell you that the internet is the Wild West. It's a hodgepodge of people with different agendas. There's disinformation, there's misinformation, there's good information. There's all kinds of stuff out there, and it's very difficult to sort through for an ordinary person, as well as a news professional. So you don't know what you're getting on the internet. And, people are putting out, I get it all the time. I get people sending me videos. Hey, I saw this object. What do you think? I said, I don't know. I can't judge it based on your video with a cell phone. I have to know, all kinds of details, and I don't have the means to analyze these videos. So it's very hard to judge the quality of information on the internet. That's why we take such care at the New York Times to identify our sources. And by the way, none of our stories in the Times relied on anonymous sources. The pilots were on the record. We named them. We used their pictures. We had documents. We had Lou Elisondo's service record. So when people later try to undermine him and say he was never really head of ATIP, or we had his commendations, as an intelligence officer for his work at the Pentagon. So we had all that documentation, but on the internet, a lot of that stuff is not there. So you don't know what you're getting.
Along the lines of this intrigue and the different agendas and misinformation and disinformation and things like that, Stuart had a great question connecting some of the dots between two different themes of your reporting.
Ralph, I know that you've written a lot about organized crime, and I wonder if you've found any salient similarities between the organized crime world and the world of UFOs, the black world, the subterfuge that perhaps they may have in common in some ways, but also how they may be distinct. You're a rare figure that's gone deep into of those, as Jay was referencing, nodes. I wonder what you can tell us about how they compare and don't.
Whoa. Well, I usually make a very obvious comparison that my reporting, that my background has been very down to earth, literally, no pun intended. Dealing with the mafia and Nazi war criminals and stuff that's really well grounded in the evils, let's say, of our reality. So that when I took up these stories about UFOs and experiencers, I was not somebody who was gullible or easily, misled. Let's say I like to maybe this sounds self-serving, but the credibility that I got from my reporting about political corruption and the mafia and the Holocaust and all that, I hope adds credibility to my reporting on other things that could be more difficult to establish, like UFOs and alien experiences. So the government has been disingenuous at times, with a long history of disinformation on the UFO question. Put out fake information. It told people there was nothing to it. It'll, just move on, forget about it. You didn't see anything. You saw the planet Venus. And the government denied the existence of organized crime for a long time. Hoover wouldn't acknowledge the mafia because he was too interested in chasing communists. So in that sense, the government had an agenda then. It had an agenda, long had an agenda to downplay the UFO story. But I don't see too many, too many similarities in that. I mean, I'm very proud of my mafia reporting, but that was something you could get your hands around. There were actual recordings, there were eyewitness accounts and this and that. So a lot of that is missing when you get into these much more problematical areas of UFOs, and certainly with the experiencer accounts. I see a question in the chat that I'm happy to address because it really strikes a bell with me.
Sure.
About John Mack. What would he say about the book, and how did the book end up the University of New Mexico Press? So that's a question I'm very happy to answer. Because this has come up before. Some friends of John Mack complained early on that you call your book The Believer, and that's a pejorative term in our world. You're just a believer. But and I get that. And I chose the title deliberately because, as I say at the end of the book, he was a believer. He believed in social justice. He believed in breaking boundaries. He believed in taking courageous steps against, the Harvard establishment. But he wasn't gullible in the sense that he believed anything that came his way. He chased down these stories, and anybody who needs to know more about John Mack should just read Abduction, the 13 case studies that form the core of his book. And he really expends tremendous effort and energy and research to get to the bottom of these stories. Ordinary people, as you know, there's nothing distinguishing experiences. They're ordinary people except for the experience that they had. They're housewives and cops and politicians and children and men, women, from all walks of life. There's nothing that explains the experiences that they had. And he as a masterful psychiatrist, and this is one of the things I admired in looking into his story, his history. He was absolutely brilliant as a psychiatrist, and he would home in on their stories and drill down and try to figure out what was it that might account for these different experiences. And he's very skeptical. He tries to come up with an answer other than the answer that he ended up with, which is nobody knows, other than what they said happened. There's no other explanation for what happened. Anyway, so that's why I call him the believer. And I admire him very much. And I say that he's really cast in the role of Joseph Campbell's hero in the hero's journey, somebody who is not willing to undertake the journey to begin with, who tries to evade it like Jonah in the Bible. And then God sends him on this mission and he has to go. And he endures tremendous hardships, John Mack, and then the hero. And in the end, he overcomes his, hair-raising, crises and emerges with the truth for humanity. And that's why, as for why it ended up the University of New Mexico Press, I had trouble selling this book to a mainstream publisher. And I had one publisher who I thought was on my side. And in the end, the publisher wanted another kind of book, a skeptical book. And I wasn't willing to write a book that I didn't subscribe to attribute it all to, mental aberrations or anthropological explanation. There is no explanation that I could find, that John Mack could find. So the University of New Mexico Press obviously is in the right part of the country. They know Roswell. A lot of the encounters happened around nuclear sites in Nevada. The West is a very fertile area for this field, as you know. And I found a very willing and professional publisher who was very enthusiastic. I'm very happy I ended up with them. So that's why the book ended up there.
Thank you so much, Ralph, for answering Mark's question. Kirsten, I think you've got another question from the member mailbag.
I do. This is from our wonderful member, Kimberly Lafferty. And she says, Ralph, thank you so much for your work. Has your worldview changed since the beginning of your work with anomalous topics? And if so, how?
Yes, I mean, it evolved because, the more I read about these cases that John Mack pursued and that I pursued, sometimes independently because they were not in his book, I cannot explain the nature of these experiences. I've looked for the explanation. I don't have the background John Mack had in psychiatry, but I cannot find an explanation, nor can any of the people who, the so-called experts who I've researched. Nobody has an answer. Nobody has a good answer. So to answer your question directly, yes, my worldview has changed, evolved. I always grew up kind of spiritual. I always thought that there was something out there that we can't explain. But the more I have looked into it, the more I realize that there's a lot we don't understand about the nature of reality. And it certainly, our understanding of the physical world has changed. And physics is now adding new dimensions to that almost daily. They're finding out that, objects can influence each other, separated for long distances, that people have powers that they can't explain, the remote viewing and the psi powers and precognition. So there is something to that. We don't understand what it is. That it certainly hasn't been explained. And the so-called skeptics are very quick to say, well, this has been discredited, but it hasn't been discredited. And nobody knows. The remote viewing, and I got to know Russell Targ, it's very strange. It's very strange. So I'm much more open now to understanding what we don't know.
Interestingly, I just got back from an international remote viewing conference that was upstate New York, and I went with our member Linda White, who's here tonight, and it was absolutely fascinating, Ralph. I mean, it was. I have yet to tell Stuart and Jay and all the members how it went in all the great detail, but incidentally, I went to school with Russell Targ's kids in Palo Alto, and I didn't know them personally. I know you've talked about Elizabeth and Elizabeth's relationship with John Mack, which is fascinating to me, and I want to get more into that since I was on the same schoolyard with her back in the day.
Wow.
And it's funny because when I met Russell Targ, and some of the members have heard this story before, when I met Russell Targ, at one point I mentioned to him that during elementary school in the schoolyard, one of the big topics of conversation between us kids was ESP. And we were really into it. And I remember the look on his face when I told him that, because he was like, what school did you go to? And I think you might have known my kids.
I got to tell you a story. You just reminded me of something. My wife and I had dinner with Russell and his wife a few years ago. He had a favorite restaurant in Grand Central in Penn Station, right, called Tracks, right by the tracks. He liked this restaurant. So we went there, and I put him on the spot. I said, Russell, let me ask you a question. I said, tell me right now, what is in my wife's bag? And she kind of had a big her handbag with her.
Yeah.
So he takes out a pad and he draws a figure, and she had her flip-flops in the bag. And he drew the outlines of a flip-flop. I mean, that kind of amoeba shape. And my wife and I were both blown away. Now, he's not himself, as you know, he's not an expert remote viewer. It's a talent that everybody has to an extent, but some people have it really well developed, but everybody has it. And he never held himself out as a great, remote viewer, but sure enough, he was able to produce this image, and it was like, wow.
That's incredible. And it's so interesting because that was like the main truth through line at this conference was anybody can do it. And it, when they did the exercises with groups, absolutely, it was amazing what people came up with. Incredible.
Right.
Thank you.
Stuart's got a question from another member.
This is from Exo Academian. He's host of the excellent Point of Convergence podcast. He's also a member here on the Experiencer group. And he asks the following, Ralph. Did John try to take into account the issue of how one's general pre-existing psychological response to the unknown, i.e., whether it was greeted with hope and possibility or fear and concern, into his understanding of how people interpreted contact/abduction experiences? So in other words, taking into account, for instance, how someone with a background where authority figures mistreated them might have a different knee-jerk reaction to an interaction with a supposedly sophisticated non-human intelligence,
Right.
as opposed to someone who'd had a positive experience of this sort of earlier life. Did John take into account how one's pre-existing psychological response to the unknown factor?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. He looked into that. He found absolutely nothing that could explain why some people had these experiences and others didn't. Nothing that predisposed people. He thought, I mean, there was one theory current at the time that rape victims were transferring their memories of their rape, their abuse at the hands of a family member or a stranger. They were transferring that to aliens. He found absolutely no connection. He said the people, the experiences he dealt with were completely normal in the sense that they had all these traumas in their background. Yes, they had suffered sexual abuse, they had suffered rape, they had suffered, all kinds of torments because they were normal people. Everybody has some bad experiences in their lives, but those things did not explain the experiences that they then vividly remembered, often consciously, but often also with the aid of relaxation techniques like hypnosis, which he used to a point. But it's a common question. And it would be nice to say, yeah, there's a correlation between people who see authority this way, and then they transfer it, and then they have, they see alien authority and they make the connection. He found nothing of that kind. So that's interesting. But these people were not ciphers. They had trauma in their lives, but nothing, but the trauma that they later experienced was not the cause of their alien encounters. It was the result of their alien encounters. So that was the big message that he tried to get out, that these people were normal people. They had all the traumas of normal people. And yet the experiences that they were relating could not possibly be explained by any of the usual explanations other than something happened to them that we don't understand. I see a question in the chat here. What did John Mack see in T.E. Lawrence? I'm happy to deal with that because it's a question I like, because I spend so much time in the book talking about his research into Lawrence. And he himself saw a reason. John Mack, being a psychiatrist, he was always trying to understand, things that were happening to him, and why was he so interested in Lawrence? And he realized he was trying to emulate Lawrence in some way, that he and Lawrence had some things in common. First of all, he found out that Lawrence was a very private person who was not a sadist or a warmonger. He was struggling with his inner life. And he always wanted to know, what is the relationship between someone's inner life and a life of action? It was a struggle that he himself was going through, John Mack, because he had an inner life. He was a very thoughtful, cerebral kind of person, and yet he also saw himself as a man of action. And Lawrence was the same way. So that was one thing. And he was able to debunk some things about Lawrence. That I said, he was not bloodthirsty. He really shrank from the atrocities that his men committed in the war against the Ottoman Turks. He was, the leader of the tribesmen, they were looking for freedom from the Turks. They were rebelling. And they committed there's horrible stories in Lawrence's book, and that, Mack dealt with about what happened in those wars, horrible sadistic things. But Lawrence that was not his thing, why he did it. And then Lawrence's own sexual perversions, which were interesting, his interest in being flogged for as a punishment for something he felt guilty about. So, in a way, it was a dry run for John Mack's later interest in alien abduction, because he tackled Lawrence with the same intellectual fervor and spirit of inquiry that he later applied to abduction. And it shows that he could be, and the Pulitzer Prize proves it, that he could be a superb analyst and a researcher, an investigator, whether it came to aliens or T.E. Lawrence.
We have a question from our member Sherry. Assuming you share some of John Mack's fascination with experiencers, and that's clearly the case here, what questions do you feel compelled to ask of experiencers or people who claim contact with non-human entities?
Well, I'm always looking for things that can verify the experience. I know they tend to happen to people without witnesses, or good witnesses, that the partner is switched off, or they, happen in a way where there's a minimum of physical evidence, which is one of the hallmarks of this whole phenomenon. It doesn't happen in a public way with evidence scattered around. It's one of the hallmarks is that it's hidden, it's strange, it's cloaked in a very peculiar way. And it doesn't happen in a way that invites outside corroboration. So I'm always interested, and I think, Jay, you and I talked about this, who was witness to these encounters at the time, what fragmentary evidence was there that it was witnessed by somebody else. There's one story I tell from John's book that I find very compelling, and he found it very compelling. Among his experiences were two girls who had a sleepover. During the night, the mother of one of the girls who lived in the house went down to check on the girls who were having a sleepover and found them missing. And she totally panicked, called out the police. The police searched everywhere because it was a terrible, a nightmare to find two girls missing from a sleepover. And a few hours later, they turned up back in their beds. So now later, the girls remembered that they had seen a UFO outside the window, and that they had fragmentary memories of an abduction experience afterward. So this was one of the first and best cases that John Mack had of an outside witness, a mother, finding the girls physically absent at a time when they later retrieved an abduction experience. Very interesting. So I would be very interested in anything that corroborates these experiences. Sometimes, it's the scars that can't be explained, or the missing pregnancies are very, very hard to verify. I'm not aware of any cases of doctors, doing a complete workup and finding that, yes, this pregnancy mysteriously disappeared. Maybe there are doctors who verified that. Implants, there's always something that goes wrong. The implant disappears, or it turns out to be they've made a biological material that's in the body. Maybe there are actual cases of implants. I haven't seen them, the cases, the write-ups. So I am always looking for, third-party verification and scientific reports. And those, of course, are the most difficult to come up with.
I just wanted to weigh in on that because we hear from experiencers all the time this kind of crazy concept that people who are in groups who have these sightings, a bunch of them may have forgotten the sighting completely, even though they were right there, or they don't want to talk about it at all. Or there's people who have seen, like we recently heard a story of someone who, took a bunch of pictures of something and then forgot they even had the photographs. So found them later, much later. This happens all the time. So it's a very strange kind of still in that realm of like this target keeps moving, even when, and especially when we're trying to find physical evidence for these things. So yeah. Jay, go ahead.
I appreciate hearing that. Stuart and I were just giggling and passing notes on the side about who's going to ask the next question. Stuart was trying to get me to bribe him to ask one of Sean's questions.
With what?
I don't know. We were just getting there. I think that's what the giggling was going to be about.
Giant stone coins of the Yap Islanders was what I was driving for. But I'll take nothing at all, because I'm a big Sean S. Bjorn Hargens fan, as are many of us in this community. We're great appreciators. And Sean S. Bjorn Hargens runs the Exo Studies website, Ralph. He has a long course, actually multiple courses. One of them, I believe, is a year long or so. Some of the folks here today have taken that course. Jay has been instrumental in it from its inception, I think. And so this is coming from Sean S. Bjorn Hargens. His question: what is your sense of John Mack's emphasis on the spiritual, transformative, subtle body aspects of the abduction phenomena versus Bud Hopkins' more physical, trauma, negative orientation, or David Jacobs' even more scary analysis of the imminent alien takeover? Are all three seeing different, but in some sense valid aspects of the abduction phenomena? Or does one seem more likely or accurate to you?
It's a good question, because it puts the finger on the differences between John and Bud and David. And here's the best way I can answer it. In the beginning, John got his first information from Bud. And I think he was bowled over by the letters that Bud gave him, the experiences. And John quickly gathered a group of his own experiences around him. And his first reaction was to believe in the literal nature of the abduction, which Bud always believed, and David believed even more, that this was a devious plan to, take over humanity. I can deal with that in a minute, but I think John always was troubled by the difficulty of nailing down, the whole alien experience, and the more he, and I think I developed this in the book, the more he looked into the nature of the anomalies, the more he saw them related to other mysterious things like crop circles and eventually survival of consciousness. There were a whole bunch of mysteries that couldn't be explained, and I think he realized that first of all, the messages he was getting from some of the accounts he was getting from some of his experiences were that they were getting transformative messages from the beings, that they had to take better care of the planet, that there was a positive aspect to these abductions that Hopkins and Jacobs weren't getting from their people. Okay, so John saw a more positive aspect to this. So this was kind of strange. So some of the critics later said, well, it's like the experiencers, or the aliens parceled it out. Like, okay, you go to Bud Hopkins and you go to David Jacobs and we'll go to John Mack. But they were kind of making fun. The truth is that John saw things from his experiences that the others, that Jacobs and Hopkins didn't, or at least not to the same extent. They didn't see that transformative aspect. They saw the alien encounters as basically traumatic, painful, evil almost, that there was some kind of an alien agenda to, create a hybrid race, take over humanity. And John didn't get that from his people. Now, was he more predisposed to a more positive interpretation? That is a very difficult question, and it's one that the Harvard committee, when they investigated him, dealt with. Was he enabling people, or was he reinterpreting the message because it was something more to his liking. But it was clear that that was something that differentiated him from Hopkins and Jacobs. I think he made a progression that they didn't make, and that opened up his understanding more broadly to a whole a more a wider look at this phenomenon, to the point where some of his experiences complained later, John, you're abandoning us. You know, you're questioning our reality. They were telling him, this really happened to me, you know, and if you doubt that, then you're doubting me. And he was, and this happened at one of Anne Cavallier's, last gatherings where John met some of his experiences. They were complaining to him that he was abandoning them because he was casting doubt on the absolute reality of these experiences. But I think he was just seeing them as more general and not as literally as Hopkins and Jacobs. So although he kind of reconciled with them at the end, they made up. And but that's really the difference between them, that John was more dubious of the physical reality of these, or at least that they were happening in a reality we don't recognize.
If I could do a super quick follow-up on that, do you think that it's fair to characterize John's perspective of it as being a both and? There is often a drive or pressure for researchers or even experiencers to locate themselves in one camp. This is physical, this is real, this is corporeal, or this is etheric, this is astral, this is subtle spiritual phenomena, or ultra-dimensional. And it seemed sometimes perhaps that John was advocating that it could be both and that it's not necessary to collapse to either or.
Yes, I think that's a very good.
Feel that's fair?
I think that's a very good analysis. He did think it was both. He couldn't decide. And he certainly, he found no other explanation for what these people had encountered other than what they said. So in other words, nothing came to him as an explanation that would answer the questions as to what happened. So he was left with, well, I have no way to explain it other than what they said. But he also realized it was happening, it seemed to be happening in another realm because it was not easily accessible to our physical reality. There were no pictures of it. There was very few witnesses. It happened in a strange kind of twilight world where people's memories would be wiped and they wouldn't remember much of it, but they could get little pieces of it, or they could retrieve it in relaxation techniques or hypnosis. But I don't think he could decide. I think he was more certain of it in the beginning and less certain the more he went on in what realm this was happening in. If that's really the only way I can describe it.
Yeah, Ralph, if above water is the public portion and below water is the private or the secret, how much of what you know or what you've been privy to even in all of these investigations and inquiry remains below water, and why?
Well, first of all, it's an interesting image you came up with because these things have been spotted going into the water, out of the water, which is one of the really mysterious things about this, that, people have an image of UFOs as operating in the atmosphere, but they've also been seen by Navy pilots entering and emerging from the water. So they are transmedia capable, let's say, which is one of really the most perplexing aspects of them. But to tell you the truth, I am not privy to some deep secret that I can't disclose to you. I don't know much more than what I've said in print. There are a couple of things that, I've been told or have seen that I haven't verified, but they're not really of of a sensational nature that would change everything I've written publicly. So I'd hate to disappoint you all by saying, I don't really know that much. There's no deep secret that I'm privy to that I can't, tell you about. I'm learning about this as much as, as I can quickly. I'm trying to get people on the record. And as I said, a lot of the stuff about materials is classified. So, we don't know. I've seen the stories are out there that we have reverse engineered crafts that, their hangars with UFOs stashed away. I don't know that that's true. There's a lot of stories like that, but I have no way of verifying them. And as I said, that's a very secret part of the government archives information. How much we actually know physically about these craft. If any parts have been retrieved or a whole craft or whatever, I don't know that any of that is true. But there's plenty of information on the internet about it, but not verified.
Well, I think in one sense that could be felt to be encouraging, because from a distance, people might imagine there's a great disparity between what you sift through and gather versus what you're able to publish and share or even speak to. And if I'm hearing you correctly, that's not actually the case, although there's a rigorous process of vetting in the New York Times and your work in general. You feel that on the whole, you have been able to share what you've been able to find.
That's true. On the whole, I have. And as I say, if there's things that we get that are, on the basis of rumor or on deep background or so, I can't use them. I don't consider them verified. We only want to print information where we can attach a name to it. There's much too much reporting out of Washington, particularly where, anonymous sources or so, and people have lost faith in some of that reporting, and we don't want to contribute to that with UFOs. So.
Thank you so much for coming. We've got one question here, and we can leave with you with that. At one point in your wonderful book, The Believer, you mentioned a line from John's father's funeral, an old Latin phrase that translates as, "If you wish to see his monument, look about you." What do you see these days as John Mack's monument?
Well, in truth, a lot of people have forgotten about John Mack. I like to think my book has brought him back, but I didn't know much about him when I started. And for all the popularity that he had, he was infamous as well as famous in his time, which is the 90s, really was the peak of his career. That has largely evaporated, I think. It's, in a way, it's good for me because I came up with something fresh to bring to the public about his life they didn't know about him, and I did it in my book. But the sad thing is that he didn't leave a lasting legacy that we can, that seems to be fresh and really popular today. So that's kind of the sad thing, the downside, that we haven't made a lot of progress. The field, the ridicule has tamped down the opportunities for research. People are afraid to get into this field. I think Avi Loeb at Harvard, I was on a show with him recently, has been quite courageous in writing about this mysterious Oumuamua, this object that all the pictures, by the way, don't do it justice. These are artist renderings that make it look like an asteroid. If anything, it's a light sail. It's a very thin thing that is drawing solar power. That is, if it is intelligently controlled, it's the first intelligent object that crossed our solar system ever that we know about. And he faults the scientific establishment for being so rigid and negative and closed. He doesn't subscribe to alien abduction at all. Avi Loeb, he doesn't identify with John Mack. He made that clear in the program we were on, but he certainly thinks there's things to investigate in terms of hints of intelligent life in the universe. But I think it's problematical today that we don't have icons like that coming out and trying to focus attention on this problem, because it's the fact that your group is out there and many other groups like that is very interesting. And these people are having these experiences and no one's really paying attention outside the groups, and that's what has to change.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for everything that you've done with regard to your research and your work and what it does for experiencers of the anomalous. It's absolutely groundbreaking, and it's so amazing for us. I mean, I know that it comes up so often, like how that December 2017 article or the Vanity Fair article or this or that or the other thing or this new book, how much it starts conversations within families, within family groups, within between our loved ones, and it's enormously validating, and it also helps ground a lot of our experience in a way that's absolutely amazing. So thank you so much for that.
And thanks for the opportunity to meet all of you. Really, it's a great pleasure. You're very courageous to meet with me, and I really appreciate your willingness to do that. And I think your stories are amazing. And I want to continue to look into this and see what I can do to get these stories out there and understood. I think the chance that we'll figure out what's going on are kind of small in the near future, but they are and this is what John Mack's main takeaway. This is a legitimate mystery. This is not something that can be easily explained by debunkers who can pluck out an answer and say, this is what it is. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. And the sooner we understand that and devote serious research money to that question, I think the further along we're going to be.
Mad props. I know you are strapped to the front of this great ship as it is thrust toward these crazy waves in this cultural sea. So I got a lot of respect for that. I love how you go about it. Thank you so much for your work, and thank you for being so generous with us here today.
Well, thank you. A real pleasure, and I hope we can continue this. Regards to everybody.
The Experiencer Group is a private gathering place for those who've had anomalous experiences, such as precognition, out-of-body, near-death, clairvoyance, ghosts, UFOs, past life, lucid dreams, and more. Within the site, members can join groups specific to their interests and access original content, including exclusive sessions where you interact directly with important luminaries and ask them your burning questions. Members also have confidential meetups with others from around the world and get access to in-person events, exclusive podcasts, and video series. No trolls, no stigmas, just intelligent, deep people like you who've had extraordinary experiences. Go to theexperiencergroup.com to become a member.